here's something to think about. What if much of what we consider, thoroughly modern medicine, things like complex surgery or even citywide sanitation, actually has roots going back thousands of years?
What a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Totally. Imagine surgical precision with, well, stone tools, or these really intricate sewer systems built before written history even existed. It kind of blows your mind.
It absolutely does, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. Healing in antiquity, early civilizations, medical practices. We're aiming to unpack the, honestly, incredible medical knowledge and innovation from way back in the pre-pottery Neolithic period right up to the turn of the Common Era, around year zero.
And the sources we're drawing on are really varied, aren't they? We've got archaeological finds, ancient medical texts like papyri and cuneiform tablets, Sanskrit writings, plus modern scientific analysis of ancient human remains.
Exactly. It's a rich tapestry. We'll be exploring how different civilizations approached healing. Think Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, the pre-Columbian Americas, and of course, the Greco-Roman world.
Our mission here is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights. We want to reveal some pretty surprising facts about, say, ancient pharmacology, their surgical skills, the tools they used, and even public health systems. Get ready for some real aha moments that might just shift how you think about early medicine.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The deep roots, prehistoric and Neolithic foundations. We're talking way back, before big cities, before widespread writing. But even then, the evidence suggests a surprising level of medical understanding.
Yeah, it's amazing to think people were already figuring out medicinal substances back then. You tend to think of pharmacology as, well, modern science, but the basics were there.
They really were. A fantastic example is Ötzi the Iceman from around 3300 BCE. He was actually found carrying birch polypore fungus.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
And it's believed he used it for its antimicrobial and antiparasitic effects. That's a really clear early example of practical pharmacology. And it's not just Ötzi. Archaeobotanical evidence, like finding specific pollen or plant remains in ancient burials, strongly suggests that knowledge of healing herbs was pretty widespread in Neolithic communities.
So they knew their plants. But what about, well, more invasive stuff? Surgery feels so modern, high-tech, but they were doing some pretty intense procedures back then, weren't they? Trepanation, for instance, drilling holes in the skull. That sounds terrifying.
It does, absolutely. And yet trepanation is actually the oldest known surgical procedure we have solid evidence for. By the late Neolithic, in some areas, something like 5 to 10% of excavated skulls show signs of it.
5 to 10%, that's a lot.
It is. We found over 1,500 prehistoric trephine skulls across Europe, Asia, the Americas. It was surprisingly common.
And a really mind-blowing part, I think, is that so many show signs of healing. People actually survived this. Brain surgery with, what, stone tools?
It's exactly survival. Neolithic trepanations involve scraping, drilling, or cutting the skull, usually with flint or obsidian tools. And the key thing is, they did it with incredible care, apparently managing to avoid injuring the brain itself. They achieved what modern analysis calls high precision.
High precision with stone. Incredible.
And it wasn't just heads. Limb amputation also goes way, way back. There's a Neolithic skeleton from France, dated to around 4900 BCE, that had a surgically amputated arm, and it had partially healed.
Wow.
Which demonstrates not just, remarkable medical skills, as the researchers put it, but also long-term community care. Someone had to look after that person.
That's a really important point.
And even older, there's a Paleolithic find from Borneo, around 31,000 years ago. A skeleton with a healed leg amputation. That's currently the earliest evidence of complex surgery anywhere in the world.
31,000 years. So without metal, how did they manage that kind of precision? Their tools must have been ingenious.
They absolutely were. Neolithic healers used sharpened flint, obsidian, or bone. And here's something that kind of flips the script. Modern tests show obsidian blades can be knapped to an edge that's 5 times sharper than surgical steel scalpels.
Wait, 5 times sharper? Obsidian?
Yes. It yields incredibly clean cuts with minimal tissue damage. So a stone tool from thousands of years ago could outperform modern steel in some ways. It really challenges our ideas of primitive tech.
Definitely.
These obsidian scalpels were likely used for delicate work, like lancing abscesses or maybe ritual bloodletting. They also had simple drills, like bow drills for trepanation and even, well, proto-dentistry.
Proto-dentistry with stone drills.
Yep. At a site called Mehrgarh in Pakistan, dating back to 7,500 BCE, archaeologists found skeletal remains of 9 adults with 11 teeth that had been drilled, apparently with flint tools, probably to remove decay.
It's just amazing. So, thinking beyond individual care, what about the bigger picture, early public health? Did these communities have any sense of group hygiene?
Well, obviously not like later cities, but we can see the beginnings. Neolithic groups often had designated waste areas, or middens, and being somewhat mobile helped prevent too much contamination building up in one place.
Okay, that makes sense.
But in larger, later Neolithic villages like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, there's evidence of specific waste disposal zones and even some rudimentary drainage channels. It suggests they were starting to think about managing waste on a community level.
A basic form of sanitation.
Exactly. And there's the social aspect, too. Finding skeletons of disabled or elderly individuals who clearly lived long after significant injuries implies that the community was supporting them, providing nursing care. That's a fundamental part of public health, right? Caring for the vulnerable.
Absolutely. It paints such a different picture of these early societies. Okay, let's move forward in time now into urban healing, Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. This is where we start seeing medicine really develop alongside these complex, settled civilizations.
Right. And let's start with Mesopotamia, roughly the 3rd to 2nd millennium BCE. This is huge because it's where we find the earliest written medical records. That's a game changer for our understanding.
Cuneiform tablets, right? What do they tell us about their pharmacy, their medicinal chemistry? What kinds of things were they mixing up?
Precisely. Cuneiform tablets. These texts from places like Sumer and Babylon list hundreds of prescriptions. They had a real pharmacopoeia, a catalog of medicinal stuff. Healers, called asu, used plant extracts, things like thyme, mustard, willow minerals, animal products.
So quite complex recipes.
Definitely. There's one tablet from about 2600 BCE detailing a remedy for rheumatism with multiple ingredients. Scholars actually see this as the beginning of rational drug therapy, trying to match substances to symptoms, even though, admittedly, these practical drugs were often combined with magic spells or incantations.
Hedging their bets, maybe? A bit of science, a bit of magic?
You could say that, a very pragmatic approach. Now, surgery in Mesopotamia seems a bit more limited, at least major surgery. We don't have a big surgical textbook like in Egypt.
But they did do some.
Oh, yes. The famous Code of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, mentions surgeons using a bronze lancet and sets fees and penalties. So surgery was happening. Doctors definitely drained abscesses, set fractures, stitched wounds. There's also trepanation evidence, like a skull from Bronze Age Iran around 1100 BCE, showing clear healing.
But generally more conservative.
It appears so, probably because they were very aware of the dangers involved in cutting someone open back then. High risk.
Makes sense. And their tools, moving beyond stone now.
Yes, transitioning to metal. They used bronze or copper instruments, knives, lancets, probes, maybe even pottery tools. Finds at places like Nineveh include bronze instruments quite similar to later Greek and Roman ones.
And for making medicines.
Mortars, pestles, fine sieves for grinding and filtering, linen for bandages. Texts even mention early catheters, probably hollow reeds, for draining urine, and describe treatments for urinary stones.
Given these were some of the first real cities, how did they cope with sanitation, all those people living close together?
Mesopotamia was actually way ahead of the curve here. They pioneered some of the earliest urban sanitation systems. Houses in cities like Babylon often had clay drains leading to cesspits.
Indoor plumbing of a sort.
Basically, yes. Archaeologists have found brick-lined sewers under streets and sophisticated vertical drains in houses. They even had seated latrines connected by clay pipes to cesspools. By around 700 BCE, cities had covered drains and regular street cleaning.
That's impressive for the time.
It really is. Akkadian texts talk about regular washing, even an early type of soap made from ash and fat. And they practiced isolating the sick, showing they have some understanding of contagion.
Okay, now let's shift over to ancient Egypt. Roughly 1800 to 1550 BCE, their medical knowledge seems incredibly well documented thanks to the papyri. It gives us such a clear window.
Absolutely. The papyri are phenomenal resources. The Ebers Papyrus, around 1550 BCE, is a classic example. It lists something like 876 prescriptions using over 300 different ingredients.
What kind of ingredient?
Things we still recognize today, like honey, a known antiseptic, willow bark for pain relief, which we now know contains salicylates, like aspirin, garlic too. They named around 700 medicinal plants in the texts we have.
So a huge plant-based pharmacy.
Definitely. And they had specialized texts too, like the Cahun Papyrus focusing on gynecology, What's really striking is how observant they were. They could apparently diagnose diabetes by noting sweet urine, and they could even recognize cancerous growths. That speaks volumes about their diagnostic skills.
That is genuinely advanced for the era. And what about their surgery? I've heard they were particularly skilled with trauma.
They certainly were. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, maybe from around 1600 BCE, is essentially a surgical textbook. It details 48 cases, mostly wounds and fractures, giving systematic instructions. Examine, diagnose, treat.
Like a clinical manual.
Exactly. It describes, for instance, how to manually reduce a dislocated jaw. Egyptian surgeons set broken bones using wooden splints and linen bandages. They stitched up cuts. They performed amputations, often using cautery to stop bleeding, and they did trepanation too.
Any evidence of more specialized surgery?
Yes. There's a mummy from the 4th dynasty, maybe 2500 BCE, with a hole drilled in the jaw, likely to drain an abscess. That's pretty early dental surgery.
And wasn't there something about plastic surgery too?
That's right. Some texts mention techniques for repairing severed noses, procedures that sound surprisingly similar to the rhinoplasty methods developed much later in India. They also routinely performed circumcision and cataract couching, which is displacing the clouded lens of the eye.
And they had specialists.
It seems so. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing much later of course, noted that Egyptian physicians tended to specialize. You might have had doctors who were basically surgeons, focusing just on operations.
With those kinds of skills, they must have needed good tools.
An impressive array. We see many depicted in tomb reliefs, like at the Kamambo Temple, things that look like scalpels, lancets, saws, forceps, scissors, probes, hooks. Finds confirm they used bronze and copper tools from at least the Middle Kingdom onwards.
Specific examples.
Bronze scalpels, sometimes with replaceable blades. Cautery irons for burning tissue to stop bleeding. Bone saws. Small surgical kits have even been found in tombs at Saqqara and Thebes. They used needles and linen thread for sutures.
And some designs were really long-lasting.
Incredibly so. Some Egyptian instruments, like certain types of surgical forceps or even a form of vaginal speculum, were so practical, so well-designed, that their basic form persisted almost unchanged right into Roman times. And some concepts even echo in modern tools.
Timeless design efficiency. Now, what about their approach to public health and hygiene? Did they connect cleanliness with health?
Very much so. Personal cleanliness was a big deal culturally. Frequent bathing, using natron, a type of natural salt as soap, using aromatic oils. Priests shaved their entire bodies, possibly to prevent lice and infections.
And in their homes and cities?
Wealthier homes had latrines, usually limestone or wooden seats over pits filled with sand. They didn't have the massive sewer systems of, say, Rome later on, but some towns had covered drainage channels for wastewater, and garbage was regularly cleared.
Water management?
Wells and cisterns were key. In Amarna, the city built by Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, they actually found evidence of ceramic pipes used to distribute water.
And any sense of epidemiology, like tracking diseases?
There's a hint of it. They might have noticed, for example, that diseases like malaria spiked after the Nile flooded each year. Texts advise preventive measures, like staying indoors during damp periods, or using mosquito nets, which sounds remarkably practical.
Okay, from Egypt and Mesopotamia, let's journey further east. Time to explore Eastern ingenuity, Indus Valley, early South Asian, and ancient China. We'll start with the Indus Valley civilization.
And right away, we hit something truly remarkable. Harappan public health and sanitation, around 2600 to 1900 BCE. These cities built arguably the earliest sophisticated urban sanitation systems in the world.
That's a huge claim. What made their systems so advanced?
Well, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had networks of baked brick drains running under the main streets, all covered up. And get this, nearly every house was connected to these main sewers via terracotta pipes.
That's every house.
Almost every house. They had indoor latrines or toilets connected to these drains, effectively flushing waste away into the municipal system. They even had features like sedimentation sumps, settling tanks, and cesspools for basic waste treatment, plus removable covers on the drains so they could be cleaned out.
So a fully integrated system.
Absolutely. One modern technical review flat out called it the first to have proper wastewater treatment systems. They achieved a level of sanitary engineering, including maybe even early forms of flush toilets and soak pits for sewage, that wasn't really matched again until the Roman Empire, and must have dramatically reduced waterborne diseases.
Centuries ahead of their time. Mind-blowing. What about surgery in this part of the world?
This brings us to Sushruta, a legendary figure probably from around the 6th century BCE. His work, the Sushruta Samhita, is a cornerstone of ancient Indian medicine, especially surgery. It describes 8 main types of surgical operations.
And he's famous for.
Plastic surgery. He's often called the father of plastic surgery, specifically for his detailed description of rhinoplasty, reconstructing the nose. He explained how to use a flap of skin, often from the cheek, measure it with a leaf template, and rotate it to rebuild the damaged nose.
That's incredibly specific and advanced for the 6th century BCE.
It really is. But he also detailed repairing torn earlobes, cleft palate surgery, hernia operations, abdominal surgery, even procedures that sound like cesarean deliveries. Indian surgeons were also performing amputations, using tight ligatures and cauterizing with hot oil, removing bladder stones and dealing with cataracts.
The father of plastic surgery in ancient India, that's definitely an aha moment. What about the tools and maybe anesthesia for these complex operations?
Sushruta's text lists an amazing 121 different surgical instruments, 20 sharp ones, 101 blunt types made of high-quality steel or iron, and crucially, he stressed keeping instruments clean, even suggesting boiling them or exposing them to sunlight. That's a very early, practical sense of antisepsis.
Wow. And pain relief.
Wine was commonly used. But texts also mention mixing herbal sedatives, things like cannabis, henbane, possibly opium derivatives, to create something called samohini, essentially a potion to make the patient drowsy or unconscious during surgery.
Okay, moving from surgery to internal medicine, let's talk about early Ayurveda and pharmacology, particularly Charaka.
Right. The Charaka Sahita, attributed to Charaka around the 3rd century BCE, focuses more on internal medicine. It's a vast catalog, listing over 600 medicinal plants and thousands of specific formulations. It shows a sophisticated understanding of how drugs work, classifying them by taste and their effects on the body.
So a real system of pharmacology.
Definitely. And by the Mauryan period in India, we see evidence of actual hospitals and dispensaries being set up an institutional approach to healthcare. Sushruta's work even touches on early epidemiology, talking about how diseases might spread through pests or contaminated water, and advising isolating patients with contagious illnesses. Very forward-thinking.
It's fascinating how these ideas pop up. Okay, let's pivot now to ancient China. From the Shang dynasty through the Han, what was their unique take on herbal medicine?
Chinese pharmacology, going back to the Shang dynasty around 1600 BCE, was deeply rooted in careful observation empiricism. The classic text is the Shenong Benqijing, compiled later but based on much older traditions. It lists 365 medicinal substances, plants like ginseng, ginger, ephedra, even opium poppy for pain relief, plus minerals and animal products.
And we have direct evidence, too.
Yes. Remarkably preserved silk scrolls found in the Moangui tombs, dated to 168 BCE, contain detailed herbal prescriptions for 52 different ailments, alongside advice on diet, therapeutic exercises, even sex therapy. They also experimented with carefully measured doses of minerals, including potentially toxic ones like mercury and arsenic.
And they developed a very distinct medical theory, didn't they? Different from the purely observational approach elsewhere.
Very distinct. By around 500 to 200 BCE, the framework laid out in the Huangdi Naijing, the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, became dominant. This involved concepts like yin and yang, the 5 elements, and the circulation of vital energy, or qi. Disease was seen fundamentally as an imbalance in these systems.
Which led to different diagnostic methods.
Exactly. Sophisticated techniques like detailed pulse taking, there's a whole text on it from the 2nd century BCE, and tongue inspection became key diagnostic tools, methods still used in traditional Chinese medicine today. There was also a huge emphasis on preventive medicine called yingsheng, meaning nurturing life.
Nurturing life, I like that. What did it involve?
Advising on proper diet, specific exercises like Dai-yin stretching, moderation in lifestyle, breathing techniques, all aimed at preserving health and preventing illness from developing in the first place. A very holistic view of well-being.
That holistic perspective is definitely a hallmark. Now, what about surgery in ancient China? Was it as central as in India or the Greco-Roman world?
Generally, no. It wasn't as prominent. Cultural factors played a role. Confucian philosophy emphasized keeping the body whole and often discouraged extensive surgery or mutilation. So the focus tended to be on external treatments or minimally invasive methods.
Like acupuncture.
Exactly. Acupuncture and moxibustion became highly developed. Acupuncture, using fine needles at specific points, was systematized by the Han Dynasty. Texts describe different types of needles and hundreds of acupoints. We've even found gold and silver acupuncture needles in a Han tomb from around 100 BCE.
And moxibustion.
That's the therapeutic burning of dried mugwort, usually near acupoints to apply heat, also widely used. They did perform basic procedures like lancing boils, cauterization, and simple wound suturing. And later, in the Han Dynasty, the famous physician Huatul was known for surgical excisions and reportedly even performed abdominal surgery using an herbal anesthetic called mafesin. But these seem more like exceptions than the rule.
So the medical toolkit reflected this focus.
Largely, yes. The primary instruments were acupuncture needles, evolving from stone to fine metal. They had bronze scalpels for minor cuts, forceps for things like pulling teeth or arrowheads, cautery irons, cupping bowls, probes. They also used bamboo or metal tubes as catheters and maybe syringe-like devices for enemas. And on the public health front, Han texts advised boiling and filtering drinking water, a simple but effective measure.
And sanitation in their cities.
Chinese cities had wells for water, designated latrine areas, sometimes primitive flush toilets. A really unique feature in some Qin and Han-era homes was the pigsty latrine.
Pigsty latrine, how did that work?
Ingeniously, if maybe not appealingly to us. The latrine was built over a pigsty, and the pigs would consume the human waste. A very efficient, closed-loop form of waste disposal and nutrient recycling.
Wow, okay, that's resourceful.
Definitely. The government also played a role. There were officials tasked with inspecting markets for bad food and overseeing city cleanliness. During epidemics, records mention quarantining the sick and using herbal smoke, like burning artemisia, for disinfection. So, preventive care, hygiene, and government oversight were all part of their public health approach.
Okay, leaving the complex systems of the East, let's cross the Pacific, figuratively speaking, to explore New World wisdom, pre-Columbian Americas, looking at Mesoamerica and the Andes. Their medical traditions developed in relative isolation, didn't they?
Yes, largely independently, which makes them fascinating. And they possessed an incredibly vast knowledge of medicinal plants, mostly passed down orally, though some later codices recorded it.
What kind of plants are we talking about?
In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs used things like cacao as a stimulant, chili peppers for pain relief, episode herb to expel parasites, cinchona bark for fevers, the source of quinine, even sapodilla tree latex possibly for dental fillings. The Aztec Cruz Badiano Codex from the 16th century, based on earlier knowledge, lists over 250 medicinal plants.
Amazing ethnobotany. Any other unique practices?
The Maya used therapeutic enemas with balché, a fermented drink of honey and herbs, which we see depicted in their art. And there's strong evidence for the ritual use of psychoactive substances for healing mushroom-shaped stones in Guatemala, go back maybe 5,000 years, and dried peyote cactus buttons found in rock shelters date back even further.
And in the Andes.
Coca leaves were crucial, used as a stimulant, pain reliever, and to combat altitude sickness. High-nutrition grains like quinoa and kiwicha were dietary staples with health benefits. Finds of coca and corned beer in mummies suggest medicinal uses as well.
Now, what about surgery in the Americas? We hear a lot about trepanation, especially from the Andes.
Yes, the evidence for trepanation in the Andes is just overwhelming. Over 800 trepan skulls have been found in Peru alone, from cultures like the Paracas right through the Inca period.
And the most astonishing thing is their success rate, isn't it?
It truly is. This might be the single most surprising fact. Many of these skulls show extensive bone regrowth, meaning the person lived sometimes for years after the operation. By Inca times, estimates for survival rates in some skull series reach 70 to 90%.
70 to 90%, that's better than survival rates for the same procedure in 19th century Europe.
Exactly. It surpasses outcomes from much later periods with supposedly more advanced knowledge. It's frankly stunning. They used obsidian knives and bone or possibly metal drills to make circular or rectangular openings.
And Mesoamerica, less trepanation there.
Less common, it seems, but healers definitely treated wounds and fractures. The Maya set broken bones with splints, used natural antiseptics like resins and honey. Aztec surgeons were known to set fractures and treat dislocations effectively.
And again, the tool's mainly stone.
Primarily stone or organic materials, especially obsidian. As we mentioned, obsidian blades hold an edge sharper than steel, almost down to the molecular level. Ideal for clean incisions with minimal tissue damage. They also used bone needles, sharp cactus spines for suturing, with thread made from cotton or even human hair. Stone saws existed too.
But the Inca had metal.
Yes, later on, Inca surgeons had access to bronze or copper tools, including their characteristic tumi knives, these sort of semicircular scalpels.
And anesthesia for these procedures.
They used powerful natural substances, high doses of tobacco, potent sedatives from plants like the Tora species, and fermented alcoholic drinks like chicha, corned beer, or pulque, agave sap, were likely given to induce a state of semi-consciousness or stupor during painful operations.
Okay, lastly, for the Americas, what about public health in their large cities?
Places like Teotihuacan in Mexico, which peaked around 100 BCE to 550 CE, had stone-lined storm drains. Maya cities engineered reservoirs and systems to channel water runoff. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, though later, built on these ideas. It had thousands of street sweepers, public latrines, and even canoes that collected human waste from the canals to be used as fertilizer.
A sophisticated system. And the Inca.
Inca cities like Cusco had stone-lined channels delivering fresh water and basic drainage systems. Bathing was also culturally important. Maya sweat baths, or temescales, some dating back over 3,000 years, were used for ritual purification, but also hygiene and potentially detoxification.
Any evidence of understanding contagion?
The Inca reportedly isolated people with conditions like leprosy, which suggests they recognized that some diseases could spread from person to person. It's also worth noting they likely faced fewer zoonotic diseases, those jumping from animals to humans before contact with the Old World, simply because they had fewer domesticated animal species.
Fascinating differences. Okay, that brings us to our final section. The classical culmination, the Greco-Roman world, roughly 500 BCE to year zero. This often feels like more familiar territory, where the foundations of Western medicine were really cemented.
That's generally true. Greek medicine, starting around 500 BCE, really emphasized a rational, observational approach. Hippocrates of Kos in the 5th century BCE is a key figure here, famous for arguing that diseases have natural causes, not supernatural ones. That was a massive shift.
And the Hippocratic corpus, that collection of texts.
Exactly. About 60 treatises covering everything from clinical diagnosis and prognosis to treatments and surgery. They really tried to systematize medical knowledge.
And they brought that rational approach to things like trepanation.
Yes. The treatise on head wounds, for example, gives detailed guidance on managing skull fractures and, crucially, specifies when trepanation might be necessary. Generally, only if the membranes covering the brain weren't already damaged. It wasn't just drilling holes randomly.
What else were the Greeks known for?
Orthopedics. They were apparently excellent at reducing dislocated joints. The Hippocratic method for putting your shoulder back in is actually still taught in principle today. They were skilled at setting fractures using splints and bandages stiffened with things like starch or egg whites. They also surgically drained infections in the chest cavity empyemas and used cautery extensively.
And later, in Hellenistic Alexandria.
That was a crucial period, 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE. Physicians like Herophilus and Erastratus performed systematic human dissections and reportedly even vivisections on condemned criminals. This led to huge leaps in understanding anatomy, especially the nervous and vascular systems, which directly inform surgical techniques like removing bladder stones, tonsillectomies, even early forms of brain surgery. They also stressed diet and lifestyle public health regimens. Cities even started hiring public physicians.
And then the Romans came along. Did they just copy the Greeks?
They definitely absorbed Greek knowledge eagerly, but they added their own practical organizational stamp. Roman medicine, from about 200 BCE onwards, was very pragmatic. Celsus, writing around 30 CE but drawing on earlier Greek and Roman sources, gives detailed descriptions in his work De Medicina of procedures like cataract couching and amputating gangrenous limbs, mentioning tourniquets, scalpels, and cauterization with hot oil or metal.
And they were famous for military medicine, right?
Absolutely pioneered it. They established dedicated military field hospitals called valetudinaria. These provided standardized care for wounded soldiers, including specialized surgical procedures like extracting arrowheads. Very organized.
Their engineering skills must have influenced their medical tools, too.
Without a doubt. Building on Greek designs, Roman surgeons had an incredibly extensive toolkit. Iron or bronze scalpels, specialized forceps for bone fragments, elevators to lift bone, cautery irons, various specula for vaginal and rectal examination catheters, probes, hooks, scissors. You name it.
And we have actual examples.
Oh, yes. The finds from the House of the Surgeon in Pompeii, buried in 79 CE, are famous dozens of beautifully preserved instruments. And the sophistication is remarkable. For instance, the Roman vaginal speculum often had a screw mechanism to open the blades. It looks essentially identical in design to specula used in the 19th century.
Unbelievable continuity. What about managing pain and infection, anesthesia, and antisepsis?
They certainly tried. Wine was very commonly given before surgery. For stronger effects, they used opium and mandrake root, which contains scopolamine, a powerful sedative. A text from the 1st century BCE describes a mandrake preparation called morion that could induce anesthesia and insensibility to pain.
And preventing infection. They didn't know about germs, obviously.
No germ theory, but they used empirical methods that worked. The routinely cleaned wounds with wine or vinegar both have antiseptic properties. Honey was also used on wounds. We mentioned the Egyptians and Greeks using moldy bread containing natural penicillium molds. Roman writers like Pliny suggested using things like boiled oak bark, which has astringent antimicrobial tannins. They clearly understood the value of cleaning wounds and used cauterization partly to seal them against infection.
But where the Romans truly excel, setting a standard for centuries, was public health infrastructure, wasn't it?
Absolutely unparalleled. This was perhaps their greatest contribution to health. They engineered their cities with public health as a core principle on a scale never really seen before.
Aqueducts being the prime example.
The aqueducts were key. They delivered vast quantities of clean, fresh water into urban centers. Rome itself, by the early Common Era, had multiple aqueduct lines bringing millions of gallons a day. This water supplied public drinking fountains, numerous public baths crucial for hygiene and social life, and, importantly, public latrines.
Flush toilets, essentially.
Well, continuously flushed anyway. Roman public latrines were often elaborate affairs with marble seats over channels through which water constantly flowed, carrying waste away. And beneath it all were comprehensive sewer systems.
Like the Cloaca Maxima in Rome.
Exactly. Built originally way back around 600 BCE and continually expanded and improved. It drained stormwater and waste from latrines and baths out of the city. Many Roman towns had sophisticated underground sewers and covered street drains. They organized garbage collection, passed laws against dumping refuse in the streets, and took measures during epidemics, like clearing slums or isolating the sick.
Just a completely different level of civic engineering for health.
It truly was. As one scholar put it, Rome paid special attention to sanitation and infection control. They set a public health standard that wouldn't be reached again in Europe until the 19th century. They even appointed public physicians, the medici publici, in many cities to provide free care for the poor, an early form of state-sponsored health care.
Wow. Okay, we have covered so much ground. We've taken a truly deep dive into healing in antiquity, and it's just staggering, isn't it? The sheer breadth and ingenuity of medical practices across all these early civilizations.
It really is.
From the, incredible precision of Stone Age trepanations, which still boggles my mind, to the unbelievably sophisticated urban planning of the Indus Valley cities, and of course, Rome. It's just so clear that ancient people weren't merely surviving. They were actively observing, experimenting, innovating in health.
I think what really stands out looking across all these cultures is that blend of, careful empirical observation, just watching what works, combined with practical application, often a really deep understanding of the natural resources available to them.
Yeah.
We've seen the beginnings of pharmacology, complex surgeries like plastic surgery that seems centuries ahead of their time, and these amazing public health initiatives that literally laid the foundations for modern sanitation. It completely reframes what ancient medicine means.
It really does. It's just remarkable how human ingenuity, faced with the universal problems of illness and injury, consistently sought solutions, whether that solution was a meticulously crafted obsidian blade or a massive citywide sewage system. So, as you, our listener, reflect on all this, what's the one surprising fact or maybe insight that you'll carry away from this deep dive?
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with. Considering the level of innovation we've discussed, and those sometimes startlingly high success rates, particularly in surgery like the Andean trepanations or the sheer scale of Roman public health, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of the foundation of modern medicine was truly laid down by these ancient practitioners, often working without germ theory, without advanced imaging, just using keen observation, trial and error, and, relentless dedication. What else might we still have to learn or perhaps relearn from their ancient wisdom?